I'm going to introduce the session on ecological silvicultural systems and a little bit on context and concepts, and then an example with what I call the Great Lakes mixed pine ecosystem, and then overview the session. So a little bit on context and concepts. Here's what we believe, we being Tony and I, and this is a quote from Klaus Puttmann from one of his books, that a comprehensive rethinking of silviculture is needed to achieve our objectives for forestry. And really, we have to go beyond just tweaking traditional agricultural or a timber-focused model to meet those objectives now. And as we get into this, you'll see more about what we mean. And our take on doing that is something we've been pioneer or championing, I should say, ecological silviculture, which is we define as a toolbox to manage forests as whole ecosystems based on emulation of natural models, the whole developmental model, and it explicitly incorporates some ecological principles that we'll look at here in a second. So one of the things that we think about is that ecological objectives have primacy in terms of what you're doing, or at least shared priority with timber objectives. That's my take. If you know Jerry Franklin, his take is that ecological objectives should be first. And then another facet of this is that an explicit goal is to reduce the disparity between a healthy natural ecosystem and its managed counterpart in terms of structure, composition, and function. So explicitly incorporates ecological principles. Here's the principles that we, Tony, Jerry, Norm Johnson, and I talk about these four. So the first one is continuity. And that's just the continuity in forest structure, function, biota, between a pre and a post-disturbance ecosystem at a regeneration scale event. And of course, that's the whole idea of biological legacies, what's left behind from the previous forest, and it translates into functionally into ecological memory. If you think about silviculture, it's really implemented as part of a regeneration system that incorporates legacy management, and we'll look at that example. The second principle is complexity diversity. So the development of complexity, spatial heterogeneity in structure and composition, species diversity in established forests. So after they're up and going. And there's a lot of ways that's implemented with silviculture, like variable density thinning, decadence creation, enrichment planting. Timing, it's just the incorporating the appropriate time periods for specific structural elements and functional attributes to develop, like a population of big trees. And it's implemented how? With silviculture, it's just allowing appropriate time intervals between interventions, especially regeneration, harvest, and thinning. And then the last principle is landscape context, and it's really implemented in a number of ways, like triad-like models that we all know about, and then Jerry Franklin's shades of green model for allocation. And it's things like edge patch structure and interaction between different types of patches. So what do we do next when we're armed with trying to learn about or understand a natural development model for a forest and then incorporating those principles? It's to devise a silvicultural system, a planned sequence of treatments that occur over the life of a forest to meet a particular set of objectives. That's the definition. And it follows then that an ecological silvicultural system is going to be explicitly based on what? The stuff I've just kind of been highlighting: emulation of a natural model of development, incorporation of those principles or ones like them, and then reducing that disparity between a healthy natural ecosystem and a managed forest. So what I think is important is definition helps us keep in mind what is not a silvicultural system. So we all hear about variable retention harvesting. It's not an ecological silvicultural system or even a regeneration system. It's a harvesting approach or pattern that incorporates legacy management. And then similarly, variable density thinning is not an ecological silvicultural system. It's a thinning approach that you use to develop heterogeneity in structure and composition. So with that in mind, that kind of background, here's an example of an ecological silvicultural system. And I work in this, what I broadly call the Great Lakes mixed pine ecosystem. I apologize to probably most of you on this are Canadians and you're cut off from this, but there's some of this in Canada as well. If you speak land fire, it's the Laurentian, Acadian, Northern Pine Oak woodland ecosystem. What do we know about this, broadly speaking? Well, we know a lot more than we used to in terms of the natural model of development. We used to think that it worked like this from what people interpreted Heinzelman's work in the boundary waters in Quinnigo with crown fire return intervals of like on the order of 200 years, more frequent surface fire, all leading to stand replacing even age forests. I can tell you that Heinzman never actually said that, but people interpreted some of his work to come up with that model. But what we know is that's not really how that ecosystem worked. So fire intervals could be really short, ranging from 1 to 40 years with a mean of 6.6 years. Specifically, that's work in northern Minnesota that Mike Stambaugh at the University of Missouri has done with us, but other people have shown that as well in Wisconsin, in Michigan, probably some in Canada as well. And it all leads to really thinking about disturbance as more of a mixed severity fire regime, including less than stand replacing fire. And the funny thing is, if you go back in the old literature, like I have cited there, these people knew that and they talked about it and they had great photographic evidence of it, but we forgot for some reason. So that kind of disturbance regime leads to this idea of how we incorporate continuity into the management of these. So the resultant stand structure of that kind of a disturbance regime is really multi-cohort stands to broadly single cohort with substantial legacies after disturbance. And Sean Fravor and I published about this in northern Minnesota a few years ago, and it just shows those different really complex age structures of old growth red pine dominated forests. And there's one of the stand maps that shows 3 cohorts of pine intermixed there. So clearly not even aged by the classic definition. The silvicultural tool to deal with that, of course, is regeneration systems that incorporates retention to emulate that natural disturbance and its outcomes. And it can be really variable in practice. We talk about it from large group selections to irregular shelter woods and maybe everything in between. Then the second principle and how it applies here is this complexity diversity. So what do we know? Well, what we know is broadly, this kind of ecosystem was really a woodland as opposed to closed canopy forest, large diameter pines, large diameter range, a lot of dead wood, mixed species composition. So maybe 10 plus species in the natural variance of this. And how do we deal with that silviculturally? Well, there's a lot of tools like deliberate decadence creation or crop tree release or to get big trees, variable density thinning, enrichment planting. Then timing. Well, what do we know about timing relative to red pine dominated forest? Well, we know that tree lives to be 200 to 300 years old versus how it's typically managed on 50 to 90 years, something like that rotation. And that only time can produce these really classic kind of structures from big old trees. And then also that regeneration disturbances were really variable in frequency, but not generally stand replacing within that kind of a rotation time period, 50 to 90 years. So what are our tools? It's to extend rotation. Jerry Franklin talks about appropriate recovery periods to allow big trees to develop and deadwood to develop. So, and then it's timing interventions on ecological cues, not just economics and growth. If we do that, eventually it brings us full circle back to continuity as a principle in terms of retaining things after that disturbance. In context, the only thing I'm going to say here is that what do we know about red pine in the lake states, the 3 lake states, is that now there's about 800,000 hectares remaining of probably 3 to 4 million between the 3 lake states, and 76% of that is in plantation. So we know that looks very different than this natural model. And there's kind of a generalized timber-focused silvicultural system. Not everybody does it exactly like this, but kind of similarly in terms of the steps and the years. Okay, so now, based on what the little bit I've said about natural development models and the principles that we focus on, here's something completely different. And it's an ecological silvicultural system for this forest type. And Tony and I have published all or pieces of this in a couple of places there, and I'm not going to go into this in great detail. Just notice that we base our events on developmental stages. from disturbance and legacy creation into potentially ultimately in the old growth stage or old forest stage. And then there's those just examples of things that could happen. Because, as I've pointed out, the natural disturbance regime for this forest type tends to be less than stand replacing. Really what you may be doing silviculturally is cycling between a regeneration event and then development in a mature forest condition with old forest structures developing, but maybe the whole stand never gets to that point. Or for some entities, organizations, there may be interest in taking that mature forest condition and transitioning it into old forests. So there's that option as well. So in a nutshell, that's the silvicultural system, the kind of things that we've been thinking about and our perspective on it. And what I want to do is just end up with this. So in the not too distant future, you'll be able to hear more perspectives and examples of this. Tony and I are editing a book for Wiley that maybe will be out in the spring. And if you look at this list here, it's like a who's who in the world of applied forestry and ecological silviculture of people that are contributing to this. And mostly from North America, but we have some from Chile, Australia, Europe as well. So we're pretty excited about that. And what we've done for this session is ask a subset. We couldn't have everybody talk, obviously, but a subset of people to speak on what they're thinking about and their take on ecological silvicultural systems. So you'll hear from these people after me here, and then Tony will finish up at the end.
Not that she needs introduction, but really pleased to have Patricia Raymond presenting as part of this session and certainly contributing to the book. And so we'll be thinking a bit about ecological silviculture for yellow birch, conifer, mixed woods in Eastern Canada. So take it away, Patricia.
Well, thank you, Brian and Tony, for the invitation. It's really nice to participate to this session. Now we're going to move toward the eastern part of northeastern North America, where we can find yellow birch, conifer, mixed woods. The yellow birch conifer mixed woods are also known as the temperate mixed wood forest, at least in the province of Quebec, Eastern Canada, where this 100 wide ecotone marks the transition between the temperate and the boreal forest. On this map, it's in the area in green. And this forest is quite close to inhabited areas, and for this reason, it's been an important place for wood supply, recreational activities, and other ecosystem services for the last 200 years. And this is also why the sustainable management of these forests needs to balance both socio-economical and ecological needs. In these ecosystems, yellow birch and balsam fir are the two main species, and they grow along with the companion species with a wide range of ecological characteristics in terms of shade tolerance, reproduction strategies, seedbed requirements, etc. These species include paper birch, red and sugar maple, American beech. Among the conifers, we have the red spruce, the white spruce, the eastern white cedar. I was going to say tuya, but it's like the Latin name, and eastern white pine and eastern hemlock. The yellow birch conifer mixed woods are so characterized by an abundant understory layer made of a diversity of woody shrubs, tree species, vascular and vascular plant species, and some species with high competitive potential, like the mountain maple, the hobblebush, the strip maple, big hazelnut, can be already present in the understory and respond to disturbance. Other species like raspberry and pin cherry are stored in the soil seed bank and germinate after disturbance. So one challenge associated with ecological silviculture, but also with silviculture in general in these stands, is to promote the regeneration of desired tree species, such as yellow birch, red spruce, and balsam fir, while dealing with the understory shrub competition. And this is especially true where herbicides are prohibited, which is the case in the province of Quebec since 20 years. And I think that this has been also a turning point. Since we could not use the herbicides, we started to think how to manage the forest and stop fighting against the nature and more get inspired by the natural dynamics. Late successional yellow birch conifer mixed woods typically are a balanced or irregular uneven age structure. They have high spatial heterogeneity, also complex vertical structure. You can find gaps of various sizes and shapes, large veteran trees, snags and woody debris. So all of the things you can see typically in an old growth forest. Our historical records indicate that the mature stands with mature and over-mature stands with irregular structures were predominant in the pre-industrial landscapes. So maintaining these structures over a proportion of the territory may help us to meet ecosystem-based objectives, for instance. Pre-industrial data records indicate also that natural fire cycles vary from a few hundred to more than 2,000 years, but generally average around between 200 and 400 years. So the severe disturbances are quite rare. And we also find more a prevalence of light and moderate disturbances, with the spruce budworm as the major driver of the forest renewal. There is also small canopy gap dynamics caused by windrow and background mortality. After severe disturbances, stand development can take up to 250 years to reach the complex composition and structure that we find in the old growth stands. So here are a couple of pictures to illustrate the developmental stages. So we have an example of legacy creation, where an old large remnant of yellow birch that survived major past disturbance. At the pre-forest stage, you see raspberry that has invaded a large canopy opening. And the young forest stage, you have many even-aged stems of mostly in shade intolerant species. Then you have a mature yellow birch conifer stands and an old forest of red spruce and yellow birch. So one trend that has been found is that when looking at the stand development and succession, is that an increase of late successional species, especially the conifers, and also an increase in the complexity over time. So ecological silvicultural systems based on natural dynamics should aim at enhancing the structural complexity and favor a composition with an important component of late successional species, including the conifers. Now let's see a few examples here at the young forest stage. The natural development can be facilitated by accelerating the self-thinning process by using pre-commercial thinning to improve the development of understory conifers and other late successional species. For instance, here we have an example of pre-commercial thinning applied in a young aspen stand, sheltering an advanced conifer regeneration. And work by Marcel Prévost showed that it could improve both aspen and conifer growth, as well as spruce survival, and aspen quality as well because of the space sharing. Mixed pre-commercial thinning can also help to increase the proportion and the development of the late successional species, and also to promote the mixed wood compositions. We have ongoing work on this right now, but not something that I could present today. In stands of intermediate age, we have for objective to accelerate the natural succession by increasing the proportion of conifers and late successional species. As you can see, it's a common theme all along. And this can be achieved with commercial thinning to remove the short-lived, shade-intolerant species and to increase the conifer proportion. And the shelterwood cutting methods are also appropriate. Here we have an example from Eastern Quebec, Charlevoix, where secondary cuts, harvesting 35 to 50% of the basal area, applied in aspen stems, could facilitate the development of the conifer advanced regeneration while limiting aspen suckering. On the graph here, you can see that suckers appeared right the year after the cut, but disappeared with time, and especially in the treatments with the lowest removal. And 10 years later, Marcel also performed a final removal of the aspen cover to further release the conifers. And we didn't have that aspen suckering problem. So it has contributed to hasten the natural stand succession towards a mixed wood production. So I think that's an interesting system to use to achieve our goals. In mature and old growth stands, we aim at promoting the diversity and the structural complexity by ensuring the establishment of a regenerating cohort at each entry and the retention of biological gases and seed bearers of rare species. This can be achieved with silvicultural systems inspired by natural disturbances, such as irregular shelterwood and hybrid selection cutting systems. Hybrid selection cutting is when we do this harvest, we harvest trees, single trees and small groups of trees. So here we have an example of continuous cover, irregular shelterwood, applied in balsam fir yellow birch stands in order to emulate the partial disturbance by spruce budworm, and also to serve as an alternative to clear-cut systems, which are quite frequent in this forest type. This method promotes the establishment of a diverse cohort of tree species. So we look at the first 5-year results, and we could regenerate red spruce, balsam fir, and yellow birch in mixture. And we could also maintain irregular stand structure, snag abundance, entry, macro habitat, and abundance and diversity, as you can see on the graph on the right side there. The hybrid single tree and small group selection cutting system can also help the yellow birch conifer stands, so mixed woods with rather a more important component of hardwoods, especially yellow birch. So in order to achieve our structural and compositional goals. The idea is to generate heterogeneity in the understory, same thing similarly to an irregular shelterwood system, in order to create a variety of ecological niche for a diversity of tree species and plant species as well. And in our studies, it was especially the case when the harvested trees created gaps of 100 to 300 square meters, where we could have a red spruce regeneration growing along with the balsam fir and yellow birch. And in other cases, we're not able to improve substantially the red spruce regeneration by natural means, even though we retain a high proportion of red spruce seed bearers. So depending on the advanced regeneration you have, we may need to use enrichment planting to maintain declining species such as red spruce in this ecosystem. Now let's say a few words about tree selection and retention guidelines in prescriptions to forest workers, because the simple application of a regeneration method alone is not a guarantee that the objectives will be achieved. And this should include instructions for the seed bearers of rare species, very large trees, wildlife trees, and standing dead trees, because their abundance tends to decrease with time in managed forests, even with partial cuts. So this is an example here of guidelines we use in our experiments in our forest types. We have harvest priorities based on vigor and species longevity, and a different legacy tree retention modalities. 15 minutes is really quick. So this is my last slide. Finally, one can wonder if and how ecological models could be compatible with global change, because they've been built using pre-industrial data. So studying the dynamics when the climate was different. Well, this is my take. Overall, I think that the approach to promote the structural complexity and species diversity is in line with the resistance and resilience adaptation strategy. We also know that some species are difficult to regenerate, especially the late successional conifers like red spruce, white pine, and black. And we may need the enrichment planting. So this may be an opportunity to use certain provenances to try to help to keep this species in the system. Or we may also start to think how if we could use more climate adapted species to facilitate the transition. But this, I think, we need more work and more thinking, but it's something to food for thought anyways. So got it, 10 seconds to go. I'm done.
Thanks, everybody. So we're going to talk about mixed woods in Western Canada now. I'd just like to, recognize my co-authors here, Elle McDonald, Phil Cuomo, and Charles Dock. We have a couple of forest ecologists and a couple of silviculturists in this group, so hopefully that's the right mix for ecological silviculture. Let's talk about boreal mixed woods. So we'll start on the map on the top. That's a map of Canada. The shaded area is the boreal forest. It's a large forest area. It's by far the largest forest region in Canada. And the darker parts at the southern boundary there, that's the mixed wood zone, essentially. We heard about the eastern mixed woods previously here. I'm going to talk about more western mixed woods. And you can see the largest area of this is in Alberta. And so that large area in Alberta, a little bit in northeastern British Columbia, Saskatchewan, and Northwest Territories. But really that's the area we're going to be talking about. And that's what we refer to as western mixed woods. And really we're talking about aspen and spruce. So trembling aspen and white spruce. There are other broadleaves and there are other conifer species, but by far the two dominant species are aspen and spruce. A couple of other ecological features of this forest. Disturbances are really important. Fires are a common occurrence in our forests, often stand replacing, but not always. We also have lots of insects. So tent caterpillar for aspen, spruce budworm for spruce are common species or common insect species. And then drought is one that's becoming more common, or perhaps at least more considered when we're talking about disturbances here in Western Canada. Other things we're talking about are the horizontal mixtures of our forests, everything ranging from pure aspen to pure spruce and everything in between. And a lot of times this really reflects a successional change from pure aspen being early successional and pure spruce being more later successional, but it's not always a linear, a straight line from one to the other, of course. And another important feature here is the vertical mixtures. So we often, the vertical differentiation, vertical layers in our forests can be quite important, particularly when we're dealing with an aspen overstory with a spruce understory. And again, that's there is a successional component to that as well. Okay, so that gives you a really, really quick overview of our boreal mixed woods here in Alberta. just want to now talk about what's our current silviculture looking like. So in general, our silviculture here in Alberta, the goal is to replace the pre-harvest composition. If you have a pure spruce stand before harvest, it should be a pure spruce stand after harvest. If you have a mixed wood stand before harvest, it'll be a mixed wood stand afterwards with a little bit of flexibility. But essentially, that's our main goal. So how that is done is essentially through clear cutting, followed by natural regeneration of aspen and planting spruce. This is often followed up by spraying herbicide on a portion of the cut block. If it was predominantly, if it was a conifer leading mixed wood, you might spray 2/3 of the block. If it was an aspen leading mixed wood, you might spray 1/4 or 1/3 of the block, something along those lines. But what that results in is essentially segregated mixed woods in many cases, okay? So instead of growing a mixture of aspen and spruce together, we tend to grow a pure aspen stand on a portion of the block and a pure spruce stand on another portion of the block. Now, I know that some forest managers might disagree with this generalization, but that's really what we often see out in our forests here in Alberta. And this does meet the legal requirement for mixed wood management. It was a mixed wood stand before. That same opening has both aspen and spruce, therefore it's a mixed wood afterwards. But it doesn't likely meet the requirements for ecological silviculture. So when we were talking about ecological silviculture in our region, some of the things that some of the principles that we were talking about were mixtures are important. And not just these segregated mixed woods, but intimate mixtures are really important to maintain that structure. And it's also important to encourage or promote variability. Most of our silvicultural work currently tends to simplify the forest and reduce variability, but we want to encourage variability in our stand and across the landscape. Okay, so that the figure there is a table we put together for the chapter in the book. Essentially got different initial stands, target stands, and some of the tools to get that you can use to get there in a variety of different combinations. I really like Brian's point earlier about harvesting isn't a silvicultural system, right? You got to put all these things together. Now, having said that, I'm not going to talk about each of those individually, but it's really important to think about this as an ecological or a silvicultural system rather than just as individual tools. Oftentimes we get focused on the tools rather than on that system as a whole. But I do want to now kind of go over some of these tools that are possible here, but it's important to keep in mind that there's it's the way that we're combining all of these tools. It's not one of them individually that's really going to make this an ecological silvicultural system. So we'll start with retention harvesting. Essentially, that's leaving more trees and forests behind after harvesting, whether it's patches of trees, single trees, whatever. The normal in Alberta is around 3% of volume remaining after harvesting. So essentially clear cuts. And many cut blocks have no retention in them at all. That's the reality of our current forestry system here in Alberta. And doing something else there are implications of that, of course. One of the things we want to get people thinking about is the trees that are left behind are not just wasted fiber. They're serving really important ecological functions. So we need to start getting that message out there. It's not just a reduction in timber harvest volumes. It's improving the ecological function of our forest post-harvest, okay? So this picture on this screen is a retention harvest from northern Alberta. You can see it's got big patches of forest and then clumps and individual trees all spread throughout. That's probably a good example of what retention harvesting could look like in this area. But it's also an aspen-dominated ecosystem, and aspen in our region, there is an oversupply of aspen in terms of our mill capacity to use. So our aspen operators are more likely and more willing to adopt some of these practices. We don't see the same sort of thing in more conifer-dominated areas of our forest because we're basically maxed out on our conifer harvest levels here. So there's a bigger opportunity cost for leaving conifer than there is for aspen. So there are some differences in the acceptance and the implementation of practices such as this. The next harvesting practice I want to talk about is understory protection harvesting. So this is the term we use in Western Canada, and particularly in Alberta. Other things, advanced regeneration protection, sometimes it's called natural shelter woods, but it's essentially a two-stage harvesting approach where you're going in and harvesting the overstory aspen, releasing the understory spruce, okay? We usually do this in strips. And what it does is it releases the spruce. We also get some regeneration of aspen afterwards. So what this could look like is at about age 60 or 70, we might go in and harvest the overstory aspen, release the spruce, and then go in for another final filling at around 40 years later, around age 100 or so, which would be more of a mixed wood harvest at that time. So what this is doing, it's utilizing this these vertical mixtures that we have already in our forests. And then we think into the future, not only can we do this on our current forest, but we can also create these stands. These are an important stand type, and we can create them in our future forests through our regeneration techniques. So let's get on to that stage of it, the regeneration side. Normally, spruce is planted, often with site preparation. This is considered good silviculture. And normally when we're thinking about what are our metrics of sustainability, one of the ones that often gets used, at least in this part of the world, is the number of trees planted. It's a very important number. And this is a common regeneration strategy for spruce. But if we're thinking about ecological silviculture, we should probably be encouraging natural regeneration as well. Natural regeneration tends to be a lot more variable, but if we're trying to encourage and embrace variability, we should be doing this. And as soon as we start looking around for natural regeneration of white spruce, we start finding it wherever the conditions are right. So where you have seed trees, where you have microsites, so usually exposed mineral soil is a good one in this part of the world, and then also environmental conditions, so not too much competition, particularly from grass. When we have those conditions, we are getting lots of natural regeneration of white spruce. And I think with a little bit of more planning, a little bit more acceptance of variability, we could start seeing natural regeneration of white spruce becoming a more common regeneration technique. Underplanting of spruce is another option. So of traveling aspen stands, underplanting them with spruce, but it's not very common as of right now. It's happened a little bit, but it's not currently happening on any sort of widespread scale. And again, that's to create those that vertical structure in our forest. Aspen normally generates from aspen suckers. The goal is to get around 10,000 plus stems per hectare after harvesting, and we're usually successful in that, except for in areas where there's been soil compaction, things like that, like roads, landings. But other ones, what about aspen seedlings, whether it's planted or natural seedling establishment? That's something else, another part of it we probably should be considering a little bit as well. Now we're talking about ecological silviculture, we probably need to combine these. So we're talking about mixed woods, how do we combine them? Up until now, we've kind of just dealt with them individually, but what are so for example, with spruce, our planting density might be 1,000 for a mixed wood prescription versus 16 or 1,800 for a pure conifer prescription. But we probably need to go a little bit further than that and start thinking about regeneration strategies. Is there a spatial structure we want to be encouraging? Is there that sort of thing? It's more than just regenerating two species individually. How are we going to combine them in a regeneration prescription? The next bit is stand tending. Most of our stand tending done currently is broadcast herbicide to control competition, whether it's aspen or grass. But there are other options. What about spot tending around spruce trees to help them get established? So Phil Coleman has done a lot of work looking at this in mixed woods, and whether it's a 1 meter or 2 meter radius around the trees, it really is useful to getting the spruce trees established. And then thinning aspen. So a pre-commercial, perhaps a commercial thinning of aspen trees. What it does is it releases the spruce trees, but it also releases the aspen trees. And we're getting merchantable sized aspen in different thinning treatments by age 30 in some cases. So there are different treatments that are possible, but I think the really important thing is that we likely need multiple entries in order to manage for both the spruce and aspen. That's not common right now. Normally we have a very narrow time frame for silvicultural activities immediately after harvest, but that if we're moving into ecological silviculture, it probably means more entries into some of these stands. Okay, I just want to end with some policy challenges. One is we're dealing with public land being managed for multiple resources, but we have a clear timber bias and more specifically a conifer bias, which affects our management. So with regeneration standards, maintaining pre-harvest composition, we're not really allowing those natural successional pathways to occur. We're trying to recreate that same stand, even if it's a late successional stand, we're trying to recreate it after a disturbance event, which isn't necessarily following that ecological processes. Even age modeling, most of the models that we use are good for plantation style forestry, not so good for mixed wood or for uneven age style forestry, which would be required in ecological silviculture models. And our tenure system here is we allocate the broadleaf species to one company and we allocate the conifer species to another company usually. So there are challenges of how do you integrate both of those together on the same piece of land in a mixed wood silviculture system. But the important thing here is that, yeah, these are challenges, but the tools are available. It's not that we don't know what we could do. We do know, and the tools are available, and they've been tried on a more experimental basis, but they haven't really been applied more widespread. And that should be the next step here if we are serious about ecological silviculture, to really apply these tools a lot more broadly. So with that, thank you. And this is just a picture from a 20 years after a understory protection harvest in northern Alberta. So, thank you.
It's my pleasure to get to introduce Tara Kaiser, who's going to present on ecological silviculture for Southern Appalachian mixed oak forests. So take it away, Tara.
All right, so I'm just going to jump on in since I only have 15 minutes and talk about silviculture for Southern Appalachian oak forests. I know one of the co-authors is in the room, Jody Forrester, but I also want to recognize David Schnacke as well. I already have a problem advancing the slides. There we go. Before we talk about how to manage contemporary oak forests, it's important to understand that present day forests in the Southern Appalachians and really more broadly the Eastern US are a product of past land use. And this past land use was varied with indigenous peoples burning and other land use practices really setting the stage for how forests responded to the disturbances during European settlement. And that European settlement, at least in the Southern Appalachians, really began in the late 1700s. And with that, we saw an uptick in the severity, frequency, and extent of those anthropogenic disturbances. In the late 1800s and into the early 1900s began a period of unregulated timber extraction, after which degraded, cut over, and abused land was abandoned as subsistence living was really no longer the norm. The functional extinction of a keystone species, American chestnut, really important. It coincided with that period of land abandonment and really began a period when span level release events became infrequent and almost non-existent. So those anthropogenic disturbances didn't occur in a vacuum, but they occurred within the context of the natural disturbances of the Southern Appalachians, including wind events from tropical storm systems, ice storms, wildfire, and oak decline and drought-related mortality, all of which occur at a variety of spatial scales. So, and here we are today in the red box with little to no anthropogenic disturbances occurring in these stands. And when we do go in and purposefully disturb the stand, it's usually a punctuated, really high intensity disturbance, such as clear cutting, high gradient, or some other one and done type of harvest. And we can see the effects of the disturbance regime during European settlement versus after land abandonment. The top figure here shows release events from a large 61-hectare oak hickory forest in the Southern Appalachians, and the bottom figure displays tree establishment dates. The solid blue bars in the top figure represent major release events recorded by ring pore species, so those oak and hickory species. And the solid orange bars represent major release events recorded by diffuse pore species, primarily red maple and yellow poplar. The take home here is that land use practices associated with the period of European settlement are really reflected in the relatively even establishment of ring porous oak hickory species throughout the 1800s. After federal protection of this particular stand in the early 1900s, the forest developed with less frequent, severe, and widespread anthropogenic disturbance. And this lack of disturbance really created conditions conducive to the establishment and recruitment of those diffuse porous species. Winners of this altered disturbance regime include mesophytic shade tolerant and intolerant species. And these species, it's not that they're not desirable, but they lack many of the functional traits and ecological values that the current oak-dominated overstory provides, while the losers tend to be these mid-tolerant, more xerophytic species like oaks, hickories, and the xeric southern pines like shortleaf, pitch, and table mountain. So most of our desired species, including those oaks and hickories, have a persistent regeneration strategy, which means if they have any chance to be in the stand after disturbance, they must be in the stand prior to disturbance and then persist through that disturbance. And they persist as either advanced reproduction or stump sprout potential. For oaks and hickories, successful recruitment after disturbance is dependent on sprouting from mature trees, which for oaks is problematic because sprouting and sprout vigor of oak declines as size and tree age increases, and the existence of large competitive saplings, which for this talk we'll define as those stems kind of 1.4 meters tall and taller. And it's important to note that the probability of successful oak regeneration is inversely related to site productivity. So the more mesic site you're on, the harder it is going to be to successfully regenerate oak and hickory. Even without disturbance, oak and hickory seedlings tend to be abundant, but they are often small, usually less than 30 centimeters or 1 or 2 foot tall, and therefore not competitive. While the advanced reproduction layer of shade tolerant competitors tends to be more abundant and much larger. So in this situation, when severe punctuated disturbance to the canopy occurs without those large oak seedlings of those shade tolerant species or new seedlings of shade intolerant species like sweet birch, black cherry, and in the Southern Appalachians, especially yellow poplar, that establish after the disturbance quickly overtop those small oak hickory seedlings and cause oak regeneration failure. If we put the different oak regeneration sources on a scale of likelihood of success, this is what it looks like, with really the only chance of successful regeneration and recruitment occurring when we get oak stump sprouts or when we get those tall competitive oak seedlings existing in the stand prior to any major overstory disturbance. So ultimately, the silvicultural prescription that's implemented should incorporate elements of the disturbance regime that ultimately produce that composition of the forest that we're trying to maintain. If we look at the disturbance regime that regenerated the oak forest that we see today, we see that the disturbances that regenerated present-day forests would be nearly impossible to replicate silviculturally, and it's not something we probably want to replicate, given that land use associated with during that period of European settlement was pretty intense and often abusive, and not something we'd want to mimic. However, we can see what aspects could or should be incorporated into management of these forests. So fire was obviously a prominent disturbance in the region, and fire can be used as a tool to help restore and manage species composition. But coupled with that fire was relatively frequent partial disturbances, so both anthropogenic and natural disturbances that affected the overstory. And these disturbances would not have been uniform throughout a given stand and likely acted at substand levels to influence structural and compositional heterogeneity. So the disturbance regime that has really perpetuated these mid-tolerant successional oak hickory forests across space and time is based on a frequent low severity disturbances punctuated by intermediate disturbances that result in the release of advanced reproduction. These intermediate disturbances were partial disturbances that rarely removed the entire canopy at one point in time, and instead kind of again acted at that substand level so that ecological memory was preserved over time. The partial disturbances that created canopy gaps of various shapes and sizes were and still are an integral component of the disturbance regime. And depending on the structure and composition of the forest understory at the time of gap formation, really create opportunities for recruitment of species across the shade tolerant spectrum. So when we think of silvicultural systems that mimic partial disturbance, we generally think of two methods in our traditional silviculture toolbox: group selection and single tree selection. Group selection is effective at regenerating upland hardwood forests and creating an uneven age structure. However, it generally does not effectively regenerate mid-tolerant oak and hickory species. Research from across the eastern or more mesic portion of the central hardwood region has demonstrated that group openings put into undisturbed mature oak hickory forests tend to be dominated by shade intolerant yellow poplar that establishes as new seedlings after the openings were created. The other partial cutting method is single tree selection. And although it's not used in mesic oak forests, experimental tests have demonstrated that it's really ineffective at regenerating those mid-tolerant species, and that in the long term, this method results in a decrease in species diversity and importance of those hard mass species like oak that are critically important to wildlife. So given the failure of even age silvicultural systems, as well as other partial harvesting systems to effectively regenerate those ecologically valuable oak species, we thought it was time to attempt something a little bit different, and different being implementing an expanding gap Femelschlag that in part reflects the natural disturbance regime of the Southern Appalachians. So I'm pretty sure many of you are familiar with this variant of an irregular shelterwood. So I'm not going to go into the details, but you can really visualize it as a series of gaps being expanded over space and time that hopefully achieve desired composition and structural heterogeneity. So why is this Bavarian Femelschlag something we'd even want to consider implementing in these pretty complex oak hickory forests? And I'll say it's all about life on the edge of the gap. So data indicate that environments associated with forest edges can increase the size and density of oak reproduction, and that edge influence extends quite a distance into that undisturbed forest. In Kentucky, Lotka and Stringer quantified the response of oak seedlings to that edge environment surrounding large clear cuts and found that radial growth of oak at the root collar, height and density was increased up to 20 meters beyond the edge of the clear cut. The likely driver of that vegetation response is obviously light. And in the figure on the right, we see a distinct pattern of light availability in relation to location within a gap. And as expected, right, light is going to be greatest in the center of the gap, with light slightly decreasing as you approach the edge. And as you approach that edge and extend some point beyond the edge, light conditions are still elevated beyond levels observed under that intact canopy. So that means there's some spatially explicit area around openings, maybe as far as 30 meters beyond the edge, where light may be conducive to the growth and development of oaks, as well as other mid-tolerant species, but not high enough to promote the recruitment of shade-intolerant competitors like yellow poplar. So as some as yet to be analyzed data that further support implementing this expanding gap Femelschlag to manage oak is seen in these stem map figures of dominant, codominant, and intermediate oak and hickory seedlings observed around the edge and then into the matrix of openings created during some traditional group selection. And we can see the spatial aggregation of these mid-tolerant species towards the edges of those openings, suggesting that we can kind of inadvertently develop some of this competitive oak and hickory seedling layer by simply punching gaps and holes into undisturbed forests. So these supporting data led to the development of this expanding gap-based Femelschlag system that we implemented in the Pisgah National Forest in Western North Carolina. And this is in the heart of the Southern Appalachians and the Blue Ridge Mountains. So the Appalachian Femelschlag was informed by the success of those oak and hickory seedlings at the edges of both natural and silvicultural openings. And the study was really designed to test the efficacy of using an expanding gap-based method to regenerate oak and hickory, as well as the other mid-tolerant species that are really difficult to regenerate. So the study is being conducted on a 61-hectare mixed oak stand, and site productivity is extremely high, with site index for oak averaging about 26 meters, face age 50. And just for reference, we start to experience oak regeneration failure with traditional silviculture methods when site index is as low as 21 meters. So this is a very productive site. So we've implemented 2 different treatments. The small gap treatment entailed regenerating about 25% of the stand in 0.1 hectare gaps during that first entry. This 0.1 hectare gap size is that upper end of what would be created during kind of natural gap phase dynamics in the region. And it's important to note that we needed to maintain operability and economic feasibility. So this is an operational implementation of this system. So this 0.1 hectares is really the lower limit of the gap size we could create in this forest type on this type of complex topography. The second treatment was the large gap treatment, and this entailed regenerating 25% of the stand in 0.4 hectare gaps during that first entry. And that 0.4 hectares is close to that median gap size created by more intermediate disturbances, such as tropical storm systems that come through the Gulf Coast, and then ice storm events. In addition to the gaps, we implemented a mid-story removal treatment using herbicide throughout the matrix. This was accomplished by injecting stems of non-desirable species with herbicide in those less than 20 centimeter size classes. And the point here was really to try to increase that depth of edge effect into the matrix. And more importantly, probably to mimic the more open understory conditions that likely existed when that low severity frequent fire disturbance regime was operating throughout the region. So we're currently in the 4th growing season after the creation of these gaps. And the plan is to expand the gaps after another 6-ish growing seasons. And this gap expansion mimics to some degree the natural expansion of gaps that occur in unmanaged natural conditions. The gaps will be expanded irregularly, this is important, with the amount of the area regenerated in future entries really dictated by the response of the desired regeneration around the edge and into that matrix, making the expansion more adaptive as opposed to being area controlled as in kind of a normal group selection type system. Gaps and gap expansion, we're not crazy. They're not going to be some silver bullet on this type of site for oak regeneration. We know it's still going to be difficult. And that's simply because of the productivity of the site, and yellow poplar competition is going to be fierce. So we do know that additional cultural treatments are going to be necessary to secure that oak regeneration over the long term. So the goals of this study and the regeneration method in particular are multifaceted. The main goal is to regenerate and conserve the biological diversity associated with the forests of the Southern Appalachians. These are the most diverse temperate forests in the world, and we have over 100 arborescent species out there, and we want to manage them in a manner that really conserves the biological diversity. Because oaks are a foundational species, we want to maintain an oak component in these forests. And given the productivity of the site, this is a really lofty goal, and it's a lofty goal even on those sites where site index is only 20, 21 meters. But we think if we have some success on this type of site, we're pretty confident that this could be a viable regeneration method across the range of oak. The structural diversity created by the repeated entries and then gap expansions will promote age class diversity that's lacking in the Southern Appalachian forest, and really create a shifting mosaic of stand development stages and associated wildlife habitats. Creating young forest habitat for game and non-game species is a high priority management goal throughout the Southern Appalachians. And by creating this mosaic of wildlife habitats across space and time within a given stand, we expect this to be a preferred treatment over some typical even-aged or two-age treatments where young forest habitat quality decreases as early as 10 years after harvest as canopy closure occurs. And so with that, I'll end there and open it up for questions.
I'm going to take over for Tony, and as Justin loads up, we'll introduce Justin. He's the Director of Environmental Sciences in the Department of Geography at the University of Alabama. And Justin's going to be talking about ecological silviculture in the southeastern U.S. pine oak forests. Justin.
All right, thanks, Brian. Let me acknowledge this was truly a collaborative effort, our contribution. So Davis Good and Dan Day helped with all of this stuff. So in the southeastern U.S., and we refer specifically to a region known as the upland South as opposed to the deep South. So say from Missouri and Arkansas east to the Carolinas, and here in central Alabama, Mississippi, north to Kentucky and West Virginia. There's increasingly managers are desiring to promote and maintain pine and oak species mixtures. And pine and oak stands, these assemblages can exist as savannas and as woodlands and as closed canopied forests. Pine and oak species can occur across a wide range of site types and exist in a diversity of different assemblages. In particular, oak diversity is really, really high. So for example, in Alabama alone, we've got about 40 different species of oaks. So clearly, They represent a wide range of life history and silvical traits with variability in shade tolerance and in longevity and growth rates and moisture conditions, upon which they would typically be dominant. So our focus for our chapter was really looking at the oaks that most commonly share dominance with three common southern yellow pines. Those are loblolly pine and Virginia pine and shortleaf pine, where under management, these taxa, may co-occur in the overstory. So we'll make really no distinctions between stands that are truly pine, oak dominant or oak, pine dominant. We'll talk a little bit more about what that might mean later. And in general, these stands that we're talking about here could really fit that looser, more contemporary definition of mixed woods, not what we heard about earlier, which is what I learned in school mixed woods were, but now people, I guess, have kind of are being a little more inclusive with that definition. That would fit what we're talking about here. Some of the classic work in plant succession was done in these pine oak ecosystems, specifically on the North Carolina Piedmont, and graphical depictions of that successional sequence are really common in basic ecology textbooks. Critical to the development of these stands after catastrophic disturbance is really the pre-disturbance condition because of ecological memory. We heard a little bit about that earlier, of course. And that's especially true in these ecosystems as it relates to the presence of oak rootstocks and their ability to sprout from rootstocks. So historically, a common way for these stands to develop within the upland South was in or on abandoned fields. So with the history of agricultural land use, there would be no ecological memory of the sites being in mixed pine oak ecosystems. And of course, there would be no oak rootstocks. So the light-seeded and fast-growing pines would be the first trees to establish and dominate the site. And then with time, a hardwood, including an oak understory, would develop. So the stands would really be two-aged, stratified mixtures with individuals growing at taxon-specific growth rates. And as the canopy pine trees senesce, those gaps would be captured by oaks. And then the pines typically wouldn't expect to regenerate under a closed oak canopy. And that's a similar story that we see in abandoned pine plantations, which are also pretty common throughout the upland South region. So the difference, of course, would be that in the case of an abandoned plantation, those pines were artificially regenerated and exist in relatively evenly spaced rows. But otherwise, the concepts are relatively similar. But then sometimes you'd hear these mixed pine oak stands referred to as mid-successional, and that's fair. Those mixtures are in fact mid-successional, but we do have examples of really old pine oak stands where we have individuals that are hundreds of years old. Those do exist. So low intensity fire can inhibit the recruitment of the more shade tolerant oaks and associated hardwoods and relegate them to seedling and sapling size classes. However, fire alone will not maintain pine dominance in these ecosystems, except on really the most xeric of sites. But fire frequency is really important for pine recruitment into the overstory. Canopy disturbance events are also critical to allow sufficient light to reach the regeneration layer. And it's really the combination of fire and canopy disturbance that's required for the maintenance of these pine oak ecosystems. And by canopy disturbance events, similar to what Tara was mentioning earlier, we're really specifically talking about canopy disturbance events that would be considered intermediate severity. So some of y'all know I love the intermediate severity stuff. So those would be events larger than canopy gaps, but not stand replacing. And those could result, like we saw from Tara's presentation, from tornadoes, from remnants of hurricanes or tropical storms, or derechos, ice storms, insects, pathogens, etc. And the return interval of those canopy disturbances of that severity is typically 20 to 50 years in these systems in this region. And these events can result in a wide range of canopy openings with a variety of shapes, from circular patterns to longer linear patterns to larger blocks. And in our research on these openings in pine oak stands, we found that the frequency of openings typically decreases with increasing opening size. A lot of them are relatively small, less than 5 hectares, but some can be pretty big, so they may last, for they may be over 100 hectares. So we would stress that the intra-stand patterns are really important here, as things like fire behavior will vary through a stand, and canopy disturbance events themselves are stochastic. So here in this image, we're looking at a mixed pine oak stand in Tennessee, where we've highlighted all of the canopy openings that are at least 100 meters squared. And we can see a range of opening shapes and sizes and spatial configurations. Then we would highlight that the intra-stand patterns are really key. So even in a stand that's subjected to frequent prescribed fire, neighborhoods of oaks may avoid shoot mortality from high temperature and recruit to size classes sufficiently large so that they can survive low intensity fire. And in these older pine oak ecosystems of the upland South, we often see that the pine components exist in patches. So that comes through, I think, in this image, where we're really looking at what is largely a white oak dominated stand, but it has shortleaf pine that exists largely in these patches. And this is pretty common in pine oak dominated ecosystems. It's when they're older, it's often not that it's this relatively even uniform mixture of these species, but there are spatial patterns that are prevalent there. And these might be the result of microsites that are drier, such as ridge tops, or sites that have convex landform curvature, or some other combination of factors, maybe the right disturbance combination, created conditions favorable for pine dominance. But typically we think of this as pine patches within a sea of oak, or small islands of pine maybe within what may otherwise be a sea of oak. Clearly, the silviculture approach we would use would be determined by the current prevailing condition and our specific management goals. So in a situation like this, where we have, we're starting with a pine plantation, and we want to move this into a more natural mixture of pine and oak. This is a loblolly pine plantation. The trees were planted and then they walked away. Not an uncommon situation at all in this region. This is on a reclaimed surface mine here in central Alabama, just north of Tuscaloosa. In this example, a variable density thinning would be a really good option, so we can retain the best pine trees and retain groups of pine trees on microsites throughout the stand that would favor pine dominance, and also release hardwoods, which are primarily oaks, in the understory. And this would introduce heterogeneity into what's clearly a very homogeneous stand. If we're starting with the condition where we already have an existing pine oak stand, so there's sexually mature pine trees on the site, then the key here would be to regenerate the pine. But what's important is that we acknowledge the inherent spatial patterns within these pine oak ecosystems. So we would recommend using regeneration harvests, clear cuts and seed trees, and perhaps even variations of shelter woods in patches. And these patches should also contain reserve trees. And in our research on wind disturbed pine oak ecosystems, we found that the reserve trees within these openings are typically randomly distributed as opposed to being aggregated or dispersed. And we would clearly preferentially retain the pine trees here. Prescribed fire would also be important to prepare exposed bare mineral soil and reduce competition from more fire sensitive taxa. But it may also, because of the sprouting ability of some of these competing species, we may also need to use herbicide or mechanical control to reduce competition from pine regeneration as well. It's also possible that even though we're really relying on natural regeneration here within these group openings, that artificial regeneration may be required to supplement natural regeneration. So something we'd want to monitor. It's also not uncommon for managers in our region to want to establish a pine component in a stand that lacks it. So in a pure hardwood stand. So in these pure hardwood stands, some people have had success with heavy thinning combined with prescribed fire and then underplanting pine. Typically that's been done with shortleaf pine. And this approach can work, but it really doesn't align well with natural patterns of stand development in these systems where we'd expect more shade, intolerant, faster growing pines to stratify above the hardwood. So we would again recommend creating patches or group openings, ideally situated on microsites best suited for pine dominance within the stand. Otherwise, the methods would be pretty similar to what we've just discussed. Except we'd be relying solely on artificial regeneration of the pine, so outplanting of pine seedlings. And some folks have recommended cluster planting, so planting at really high densities. A lot of that work's been done with shortleaf pine. Probably wouldn't have to plant as high in density with, say, loblolly pine, like say 1 by 1 meter spacings. Our take-home message here really is, I think, a couple of things. One is that the silvicultural system should acknowledge spatial patterns and be thinking about spatial patterns and groups and the real distribution of pine and oak in what are these pine oak mixtures, where there's usually clear groupings of pines within what's otherwise maybe largely an oak stand. The other take home is that regardless of our initial starting condition and specific goals, what's really important long term is the maintenance of pine. That's really the key here. And that's it. Thanks.
Our next speaker is Miguel Montoro Garona, and Miguel is at the University of Quebec, Abitibi in the Forest Research Institute. And so we're headed back north again. And Miguel's going to talk about new silvicultural treatments for sustainable management in the boreal forest. So, Miguel.
Thank you very much, Brian. I'm very happy to be here today with the college to share my experience with silvicultural, with applied silviculture. And to start today, I want that you close your eyes and you imagine boreal forest. I'm sure that many of you imagine something like this, but also boreal forest is managed. And we can see like there is clear cut also around the boreal forest. The thing is that boreal forest is the second terrestrial biome more bigger in the planet, and 25% represent 25% of the boreal or the world forest, and 57% of the global wood consumption. For this, we need to manage this forest to produce ecosystem services, etc. But the reality is that we are in one world where there is many natural resources demands to answer to the big overpopulation that we have. For this reason, we need to extract and to exploit the natural resources. But today, we are able to harvest and to extract the resources faster and at bigger scale in comparison with the past. Only in the next 40 years, the global wood world is expected to increase to be the double. And for this, maybe there is one big pressure expected for the boreal forest. The thing is that now we try to change the forestry paradigms to try to combine the ecology, the economy, and the society. And our big challenge today is the implementation of the sustainable forest management. But to reach this, even if Canada is a fifth country in forest surface, around 90% of this surface is harvested with clear cut. Then we need to diversify this silvicultural treatment to adapt to the natural disturbance regimes. And the thing that happens is that partial harvest is considered like a good option for this. The problem is that partial harvests were developed in Europe more than 1 century ago and are not adapted to the boreal forest, Canadian boreal forest condition. For this reason, we need more research to know if the partial harvest treatment are able to promote the growth of the trees, are able to guarantee the regeneration of the stem, and also to minimize or to provide one level of winter mortality not so much strong. To answer this question, I was studying my PhD and the last 10 years too. And I'm lucky because I have one experimental design established by the Canadian Forest Services in 2003. And is composed for black spruce stem, mature and pure. There we have 6 sites with different replication of 3 experimental shelter wood treatment, 1 seed trees and 1 seed trees 2, and 1 untreated treatment, and 1 clear cut. The thing we want 50% of the harvest intensity. This is the state in 2003, and this is 10 years later. We can see like after the treatment, the regeneration stand to colonize the trial. We have one experimental unit per site, and we can see this on Google Map. It's one big scale experiment. To answer the question, I'm going to start with the growth. We apply one ecological study. We extract many cores for the trees, and the response was here. We can see in white before harvest and in gray after harvest. We can see the strong response and the strong increase of growth after harvest. Each black line represents the treatment, each white line represents the control. It was all the trees reacted around more of 40 and 60% in compared with the control. And the most stronger response was in mini street, one kind of shelter wood treatment. Also, we determine one temporal response. We show how that is 3 steps after treatment for the growth. The first step is the shock thinning, and it's around between 3 or 4 years, depending on the trees. After the trees start to react and to increase the growth until the number 9, and after this start to decrease until the level before harvest. Our model show how finally the growth response depends on the treatment time, structure, and growth before harvest. Here I can show how the young stem and older stem and the different treatment. And the thing that happened is that the treatment were more stronger. The growth response was stronger in the younger stem in comparison with the older. Also, we show how the mini street and selection distance was the most stronger, the most efficient treatment for growth. And also, we can see inside of this how each black bar corresponds to the edge trees, and each gray bar is the interior trees. The trees located at the edge increase the growth 2 times in comparison with the trees located in the interior of the band, or the residual band. To see this better, we can see even how they react before. You know, there is one delay in the growth for the edge trees. And this was explaining for the competition. The competition was the main factor to explain this. But it was not one surprise. When I was working in this, I see the response of these trees before harvest. Before after harvest, for edge and for interior trees. We published this 4 years ago. And my student Martin, that have also one poster in NAFEW, will continue this research. Also, I see like the growth is so complex, and that we were not able to explain only 40% of the growth response. For this, I decided, I discovered that there is one malediction for black spruce, and only the previous studies only explain around 50%. For this, I decided to do another study to create a new approach to study the growth using nonlinear models, because sometimes with the STEM, when we use a STEM model, we simplify the reality, and in this way, we lost so much information for the growth response. Then finally, I determined that there is 4 response for the trees. The classic logarithmic curves with the 52% of the response. The curve number 2 was the curves with the low response of the trees. Only 4% of the trees react like this. The interior tree reacted with the curve number 3, and the exponential form was for the edge trees. The thing that happened is that finally there is not any general growth response. The response of the trees after harvest will depend on the combination of curves that you have. We published this paper in PLOS One also 3 years ago. For the mortality, we decided to study one disturbance that is not the most popular. In the red carpet of the natural disturbances, everybody knows many things about fire and about insect outbreak. They got all the attention and all the money for the research. However, windrow is one understudied disturbances. Windrow started to be studied after the UFRO conference, Milan trees in '94. But the paradox things is that in the place where there is the long fire fire cycle, in this case, secondary disturbances have so much importance. This is the case of the North Shore, one of the most productive regions in Quebec and my study area. In this case, between 20 and 30% of the trees diet for windrow. This is though essential, consider this, especially after partial harvest, because partial cutting increase the wind exposition for the tribe, and this can increase the windrow mortality. In my previous study, I determined that there is one relationship between the harvest intensity and windrow, and finally partial harvest, even that have one higher level in comparison with the control, is moderate. It's between 50%, and 40% of the mortality for windrow. Finally, the windrow effect was explained for the wounded trees, the trees that were affected for the machinery. The forest fragmentation, this is the location of the stem at the landscape scale, and of course the effect of the silvicultural treatment. With these 3 variables, we were able to explain 75% of the mortality. This paper also was published 2 years ago. And now my student Michelle will continue with this research to study the importance of windrow in riparian buffer. For the regeneration, black spruce has one complex regeneration. He is so dependent on the mineral soil and also need the lateral shadow. And what happened that with the silvicultural treatment, with the scarification, we expose the mineral soil, and with the residual trees, we provide lateral shadow. Then we provide the best substrate and light condition for the regeneration. Our results show how all the partial harvest treatment, where especially in younger stems, have one high level of seedling density after harvest. Especially in the younger stem, even the control get one higher level in comparison with the clear cut, and the ministry treatment was the most efficient for the due to the high density of scarification plot. For the patterns, we determined that the position of the seedling in the trial and in the stem in the harvested follow one spatial pattern, and we can see like how in the residual band it was the layering of black spruce, and in the trial were the sexual seedling, original sexual seedling. The thing is that this paper was published too, and now some of my students will continue with this research, working to better understand the pattern of regeneration. Also, with my postdoctoral research, we try to discover what is the factor, the substrate factor behind the partial harvest, and we determine that the pre-harvest characteristics are essential to take into consideration to select the stem and to apply the silvicultural treatment. We published different papers about this in the last year, but also now we are working so much in the importance to study the impact of partial harvest on biodiversity. For this, I was working in different countries, in Sweden with my students and you, that have also one poster, and also in Mexico, where we show how partial harvest also were able to maintain the level of biodiversity for biophyte. And now I have other projects to study the biodiversity of fungi after partial harvest here in Esquer Lake. I have not so much time to explain all the things that I want, but I want to share with you something more about my current research. And it's like we are now developing a new axis. I'm sure that That I ask somebody, what can you see here? The aquatic people can say, I see a lake, and the forest people say, I see a forest. The thing is that in nature, everything is in interaction, the forest and the lake. And forest management sometimes don't include everything in all the prescription. The unique tool, silvicultural tool that we have for preserve aquatic system is the riparian buffer, but it's not adapted to all the conditions. For this, I decided to develop a new research axis to study this kind of interaction. Can you see here one gradient in the water brown and the water clear? This is the forest in the lake, and this is the impact also of the harvest in the lake. To better understand this kind of impact, we developed one study where we are going to study the impact of harvest to 6 different lakes, before harvest and after harvest, to monitoring the impact at the trophic level, at the physiochemical cycle, and also in greenhouses effect. There is 22,000 lakes in my region, in Abitibi, and it was so difficult to only found 6 lakes without harvest. Also, we are studying the biodiversity of Esker Lake, one of the and Esker Forest, one of the most singular ecosystems in Abitibi. And the last year, we discovered 2 dragonflies. 2 things I want to talk about the importance of collaboration in silviculture, because silviculture is how we harvest in many different places, and we can learn of many different techniques and practice together. For this reason, we must collaborate. In the last year, I collaborate to understand the potential of partial harvest like tool for carbon sequestration. Also, with Alexia Akin in Laval University, we wrote one paper to study to adapt silviculture to climate change. And now I try to develop a new model to understand about how we can to manage the forest in the future. And the importance to work with smart forests and the big networking to provide big scale studies. Anyway, coming soon, I'm going to publish one book to adapt silvicultural forest management in boreal forest. This book is one big collaboration about 160 authors around the boreal biome, and it will publish it in October. Thank you very much for this time. I am here for the question.
Tony D'Amato, many of you know him. Tony is at the Rubenstein School of the Environment and Natural Resources at the University of Vermont. And what Tony's going to be talking about is ecological silviculture for northern hardwood ecosystems. Tony?
Thanks, Brian, and thanks for organizing this session, and really, as many people already know and appreciate all that you've done to really champion these ideas, and both with the textbook and many other efforts. So great to end this session, and I think it's useful just to reflect on the fact that we didn't have a single presentation on Douglas fir retention following harvesting, and I think many people often assume that ecological silviculture is just retention, and then often just a concept from the Pacific Northwest. And I think, like any other silvicultural system, this session has really nicely illustrated that it's about specific sites and integrating and understanding the ecology and the culture and the economic dynamics of that local region to what you're doing. So I appreciate all the great presentations that have been in the session today. And what I'll do just to end us out is just talk a little bit about ecological silviculture for northern hardwood ecosystems, and really building upon, and I think having some consistency with some of the other messages that have come across from the presentations before me. So most are familiar with northern hardwood ecosystems, but really of our session, I guess this is the one that really has the most cross-border overlap, and as many are aware of, really can extend all the way down into the Southern Appalachian region. But what we're really talking about is kind of this core area where northern hardwoods are kind of a matrix forest condition over large areas. And there's a lot of variety in this forest type, depending on soil fertility and other aspects of the ecosystem. But generally, we think of these as being dominated by sugar maple, and depending on where you are, American beech, as well as yellow birch. But they also contain a pretty significant conifer component, again, depending on the site, as well as the disturbance history. And so some of those kind of northern hardwood mixedwood forests can be quite important as well throughout the range of the species. So as Tara mentioned, as well as Justin and others, really the current context of the forest type is really important as we think about ecological silviculture and how land use in particular has had a really dramatic impact on the forests that we're working with today, and how that might set that on a certain trajectory as it relates to our ability to achieve particular ecological silvicultural objectives. So this map here is just showing for the northeastern states. I apologize to Quebec and New Brunswick. The trend continues across the border, don't worry. Just showing kind of the average age within forest inventory and analysis plots from some work that Mark Ducey did in the region 2013. And it really speaks to really the legacy of historic agricultural clearing, followed by agricultural abandonment, where those areas have kind of regrown back to trees, as well as in other areas, just pretty heavy intensive harvesting that's largely simplified and homogenized these forests, both in terms of their age structure. So they're no longer the old multi-age forests that we often associate with northern hardwoods, as well as their composition. In particular, kind of predominant management approach to many of these forests is single tree selection or other partial harvesting that really pushes these forests towards dominance by shade tolerant trees, as well as exploitive cutting like high grading that also kind of pushes these forests towards dominance by shade tolerance trees with little compositional diversity. So what we know about these ecosystems is somewhat similar to some of the other discussions that have happened talking about other deciduous forests in the eastern US, both with Justin and what Tara were talking about, and that these forests really had of a mixed disturbance regime that was dominated at fairly frequent levels by gap phase dynamics. This is pretty consistent whether you're in a cove hardwood stand in North Carolina or in an upper peninsula of Michigan, where kind of the average decadal disturbance rate ranged from 5 to 20% of the canopy. What was important is that was often interrupted by these critical intermediate disturbances, the things that Justin was talking about in his presentation. So to illustrate that, this is just showing canopy area disturbed in old growth hardwood stands, as well as old growth hardwood conifer stands or mixed woods in northern Maine, some work that Sean Fravor did. And you can see that over time, there's certainly this low average rate of disturbance, but every 5 to 6 decades, there are 20 to 30% of the canopy is disturbed in these ecosystems. And really what this results in is that naturally these forests are uneven aged, but often dominated by 2 to 3 cohorts, and often have not just dominance by shade tolerant trees, but these moderate severity events that occur really are critical for sustaining and recruiting those intermediate species and intolerant species. Again, a common theme we've been hearing throughout the presentations today on how do we maintain some of that compositional diversity. When we look at the structural conditions of these forests, I would argue that diameter distributions haven't been looked at more in any ecosystem than northern hardwoods. And part of that is because diameter distributions are often how we manage these forests. We're using single tree selection and marking to some target structure, a pretty common silvicultural regime. But when we look at natural diameter distributions in these forests and kind of what the most common emergent distribution form is, we generally see this rotated sigmoid form. And so this is some work from Goff and West, who at the time thought this was a mistake. They really were expecting to see a reverse J-shaped curve, but kept encountering this rotated sigmoid curve. And Craig Lorimer and others have really highlighted that this is really a natural outcome of both those mesoscale disturbances, as well as this U-shaped mortality trend that we see in old growth forests that really creates and reinforces this rotated sigmoid curve. And what it really presents us with is a situation where there's a lot of kind of moderate sized canopy trees, as well as fewer large canopy trees that over time are kind of perpetuating some of that structural complexity that we're looking for in these systems. And what's important to point out is that when we're marking these forests, so you're actually using kind of traditional silvicultural guides, most of our marking guides kind of stop before we get into these large size classes. And so the ability to even manage for or experience these large tree legacies is pretty limited, particularly in the traditional application of uneven age management in these systems. So what also happens, and Patricia's talk really touched upon this in terms of her priorities for leaving trees behind, is that in northern hardwood systems, like many others that have historically been managed with selection methods, rightfully so, if we're thinking about improving economic value of that stand over time, the first trees that we're removing are those trees that are highest risk and cull. And what we're basically doing is stripping out and eroding the capital of that stand for future deadwood recruitment, both in terms of downwoody material and more importantly, in terms of cavity trees. So what this figure is showing is just what we tend to see for stands that are managed with single tree selection in these bands relative to what's been observed across both the lake states as well as the Northeast region in terms of range of deadwoody material and old growth stands, as well as unmanaged second growth stands. And likewise, we see the same exact situation here where selection stands have a much lower basal area of snags relative to old growth stands and even unmanaged stands. Again, pointing to the fact that we're often targeting those risky trees that, again, make perfect economic sense to be taking out from a traditional model, really are those critical cavity makers going forward and future dead wood on the site. So when we're dealing with ecological silviculture in northern hardwoods, we're really trying to address some key issues that have come about both from historic land use as well as how we've applied silviculture in these systems. And that is trying to restore aspects of that structural complexity, particularly kind of these large trees, both living and dead, multi-cohort structure, that spatial irregularity that's been talked about today in many of the presentations, as well as trying to maintain and sustain compositional diversity, something that's really been a challenge using some of the traditional models for these forests. And so thinking about continuity, what Brian was talking about, kind of that long-term legacies of living and dead trees on these sites, one of the key issues, again, is that when we're marking these forests, and this graph here is showing in a solid line, this is a traditional marking guide, the Arbogast guide, that we always have a maximum diameter above which all trees are cut, right? And so we're basically eliminating the opportunity for continuity in these forests. And so if we were to adjust these marking guides and use approaches like Bill Keaton's advocated for, the structural complexity enhancement, we're building in additional stocking in that forest to deliberately carry some of those trees that are going to be legacy trees, and also allowing those trees to live out their lifespan. This creates a situation where we're actually integrating into our tree marking and into our stocking this idea that we're going to have kind of future large live tree and dead tree legacies in the site. The issue is that, we need to get those large trees there quickly. And so Craig Lorimer, who I guess I'm going to get a dime every time I mention his name in this presentation, but he's, so influential on my thinking and many others' thinking on ecological silviculture, really did some great work in the late 90s on, using crown thinning as a way to accelerate some of these components and bring that large tree component back in the stand. The real issue, though, with just focusing in on marking to a certain structure is that it might ignore that regeneration environment that's so important for recruiting that mid-tolerant component in these systems. And so what's happened in the evolution of ecological silviculture in northern hardwoods is that in many cases we've started with the regeneration harvest, really focusing in on what are the opening sizes needed to get back to species we're interested in, and then integrating retention within those openings as a way to retain those legacies. And so instead of marking for a given structure and getting our big trees that way, thinking more about how big trees integrate with our regeneration objectives, some basic sense of silviculture. Speaking of regeneration objectives, certainly structural complexity is lacking from a lot of our northern hardwood systems. But again, the big issue with a lot of these forests is also how long-term management with partial canopy disturbances has really perpetuated dominance by particular species that are shade tolerant. So this picture on the left is an example of what people often call mapleization, so kind of pure dominance by sugar maple in stands that are managed with single tree selection. And deer, unfortunately, are further influencing if trees can even get to the sapling size class. And on the right, for lack of a better term, some have called this beech hell, where you just have dominance by understory beech in areas that are being treated again with single tree selection. And so, as I mentioned, I was going to say Craig Lorimer's named a lot today. What Craig and others really have highlighted is that when we look at natural forest systems, it's these mesoscale disturbances that have been really critical and influencing the development of these forests in terms of both structural complexity, but more importantly, maintaining less tolerant tree species as very important canopy components in these ecosystems. So what we're looking at here is kind of the distribution of gaps, so number of gaps, and then the actual aggregate gap area below, following a mixed-severity wind event in Wisconsin. And what Craig really pointed out is the importance of these mesoscale events and generating the light environment needed for those moderate tolerant species. And what that's led to is really an embrace of those femmelschlags that Tara was talking about in her presentation, where we're using kind of larger canopy openings that really approximate those intermediate disturbances and using those in a way that really allows us to create the regeneration environment and then adapt that environment over time. And so this is a picture from Wisconsin of an irregular group shelter wood with retention that really is emulating those downbursts. And likewise, a lot of the work from Quebec, certainly Patricia's work and Steve Bedard's work, has been highly influential in thinking about ways to use continuous cover irregular shelter woods to both create those regeneration environments as well as structural complexity over time. This figure also points out is that in these ecosystems, we also have to account for other key barriers like herbivory and how that might affect the ability to actually sustain these species over time. Likewise, what those large openings contain beyond light are unique microsites. And so many of us recognize the importance of tip-up mounds as microsites for small seeded species like yellow birch, spruce, hemlock, even northern white cedar. And some recent synthesis work by Crystal Kern really highlights that, looking at what follows moderate severity wind throw and how important tip-up mounds are for species like hemlock and yellow birch in these ecosystems. What the work has also shown is that on tip-up mounds, tree species being higher above the ground were less likely to be browsed. And so kind of that natural kind of browse protection mechanism that these structures created. So when we look about creating ecological silvicultural systems, that context that Brian talked about really is critical in that we're not starting from ground zero or even a 5-year-old plantation. We're really starting from forests that are already even aged in that late young forest and early mature forest stage. And so what we're trying to do really to kind of restore some of that complexity is to build upon any complexity that already exists in those forests. So are there pockets of regeneration or recent downbursts that we can build treatments off of, but really using multi-age regeneration methods like group and patch selection, and certainly those irregular shelter woods that Tara talked about. And the goal, and ironically very consistent with the gap size that she was talking about, is to really emulate kind of both the fine scale natural canopy disturbances, things like 4/100 to 2/10 of a hectare in size, as well as those mesoscale events that really were critical for sustaining that diversity of species. And so if we were to start kind of with that even age condition, so looking at this diagram here, really the goal is not to have this stand-wide heterogeneity, stand-wide homogeneity in achieving ecological silviculture. Really the idea is that the gap scale and mesoscale, we have this mosaic of conditions that's evolving over time. And again, we're all not getting royalties for mentioning irregular shelter woods, but a lot of those methods really are well suited for this. And so initial entries might really focus in on creating canopy gaps that either in future entries could be expanded depending on how that regeneration is growing in edge environments, or actually could serve to be kind of gaps in their own right, and then future gaps are created elsewhere in more of a shifting mosaic that might be analogous to what we call a continuous cover irregular shelter wood. The key thing is that we're creating regeneration environments and then also thinking about deadwood creation and legacy retention across that site. And so subsequent entries kind of doing similar things to what has been described by others, where we're either expanding upon those gaps or creating new gaps to really restore some of that complexity. So what's, I think, really challenging sometimes with northern hardwoods is that there's elements of the historic system that do emulate kind of these gap phase dynamics, but they really are a truncated view of kind of how these forests naturally develop and the range of dynamics and structures that exist within them. So having a flexible system, and again, bringing in some of these kind of newer methods of silviculture, newer in quotes being they've been around for 100 years, but these irregular shelterwood approaches that have a bit more flexibility in restoring both compositional complexity and structural complexity is critical. And as Patricia mentioned, at the end of her talk, there's a lot of consistency between the outcomes of ecological silviculture in northern hardwoods and other systems and emerging objectives around adaptation and mitigation. And many of the areas that northern hardwoods dominate are owned by family forest owners. And many of these programs like Foresters for the Birds are creating structures that are very consistent with what ecological silviculture aims to achieve. And so I think there's a lot of opportunity to really connect with those objectives going forward.